This happened to me last year. For work, I was stationed in a small town during the dead of winter. The distances between settlements were vast, so I often had to travel long stretches of road. On this particular morning, my driver and I set off early for a neighboring settlement. It was a long journey, 300 kilometers of concrete road, and the temperature hovered around 40 degrees below zero. Thankfully, our vehicle was reliable, and I planned to relax and nap during the 3 to 4 hour drive. We had barely covered 10 to 15 kilometers when we approached a small village. The road was still in good condition and eerily empty. We were cruising at a moderate speed of about 90 kilometers per hour when a strange unease washed over me. I've never been afraid of speed, and am accustomed to fast driving, but something felt off. I asked the driver to slow down. He glanced at me in surprise but obliged, reducing our speed to around 50 to 60 kilometers per hour. Barely a minute later, a small car careened out of a turn, skidding sideways and hurtling directly toward us. By some miracle, the driver managed to swerve just in time to avoid a collision. We stopped to check if the other car needed help, but its driver, wide-eyed with terror, didn't even roll down his window before speeding away. Given the desolate, shadowy road, his reaction wasn't entirely unexpected. We got back in our car and continued. I tried to doze off, but sleep eluded me. The air inside the vehicle felt heavy, oppressive, almost suffocating. I cracked the window slightly to let in the icy air, but it didn't help. Instead, I began feeling an unsettling presence, as though someone, or something, was sitting in the back seat. I glanced behind me repeatedly, but there was nothing there. After we passed the village, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, waking only when we reached Urengoy. A week later, we returned. By then, the unsettling encounter had faded from my mind, dismissed as the result of sleep deprivation and nerves. Not long after, I stumbled upon a local news report. A young man had been driving that same stretch of road late at night to pick up his girlfriend from the train station. On a perfectly straight, empty road, his car inexplicably veered into the oncoming lane and collided head-on with a truck. Investigations revealed no alcohol in his system and no mechanical issues with his car. There was no logical reason for him to have turned the wheel. Curious, I asked some locals about the road. Their expressions darkened as they explained its sinister reputation. It was built directly over an ancient cemetery belonging to the indigenous people. When construction began, the locals pleaded with the authorities to shift the route by a mere 100 meters to avoid disturbing their ancestors' graves. The officials, however, refused and pressed ahead with the original plan. The villagers cursed the road, warning that the authorities' arrogance would come at a cost. To this day, they say, the road takes its toll on those who travel it. My grandmother often shared eerie stories from her life. Two, in particular, stand out. The first took place when she was young. One winter morning, she was heading to work at the factory. Only a handful of people waited with her at the tram stop. When the tram arrived, Grandma was the last to board. But as she stepped onto the snowy platform, she slipped and lost her footing, falling backward. She flailed, unable to grab the handrail. Just as the tram doors began closing, an unseen force shoved her forward, propelling her safely into the car. Dazed, she turned to thank her savior, but the platform was empty. "It must have been my guardian angel," she would always say. The second story came years later, after her father passed away. He had lived in a village, while Grandma had moved to the city and couldn't visit his grave often. One night, she began having recurring dreams where her father, as stern as he'd been in life, scolded her. He demanded to know why she hadn't visited his grave. Grandma described him as a man who never raised his voice. He didn't need to. One look was enough to instill obedience. She finally visited his grave, leaving flowers and saying a prayer. The dreams stopped for a time, but the following year they returned, just as vivid and insistent. Since then, she's made it a point to visit his grave every summer. He won't let me rest otherwise, she says. This happened during the New Year holidays. My husband and I were visiting his relatives in their village. We spent the evening enjoying their company, but after midnight, it was time to head home. My husband and his sister stepped outside first, while I lingered a moment longer. As I closed the gate behind me, I held it open absent-mindedly, still half asleep. My husband and his sister turned back, confused. "Why are you holding the gate?" my husband asked. "Someone's coming after us," I murmured. The words were out of my mouth before I realized how strange they sounded. There was no one else outside but us. We started walking. The night was beautiful, silent and still. We chatted about trivial things, but then an oppressive feeling settled over me. It felt as though we were being watched. My skin crawled as I sensed eyes boring into my back. At the same time, my husband's sister and I turned around. Behind us, a shadowy figure darted across the road and disappeared into the darkness near an abandoned house. It was so quick, my husband didn't see it. His sister was furious. "You invited something to follow us," she snapped. The rest of the walk was filled with tense silence, each of us muttering prayers under our breath. When we reached home, my husband's sister told us an even creepier story. A few nights earlier, she had been walking home with her aunt and her 6-year-old nephew. As they passed a street lamp, the aunt suddenly stopped and stared. There, clinging to the post, was an old woman dressed entirely in black. She swayed back and forth as though caught in some invisible wind. The aunt moved closer, thinking it was someone she knew. My husband's sister tried to stop her, insisting they leave, but the aunt wouldn't listen. As she approached, the old woman's swaying grew more erratic. Then, without warning, she collapsed and vanished into thin air. Later, I learned from my grandmother that the spot where it happened was once the home of a feared village witch. Even as children, they avoided it,